Hey everyone, tonight we're diving headfirst, or perhaps more accurately, hair first, into a truly wild corner of history. Imagine waking up one morning, running your fingers through your hair, and finding a patch missing. Now, imagine that moment not as a minor cosmetic concern, but as a chilling, undeniable sign that something truly sinister, something demonic, was trying to claim your very soul. You're not just having a bad hair day. You're potentially staring down an exorcism, or worse. It's a reality check that makes your morning commute look like a picnic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're enjoying the vibe, like and follow the channel to keep this sleepy history train rolling. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're drifting back, way back, to a time when the world hummed with unseen forces, and the line between the natural and the supernatural was as thin as a single strand of hair. In ancient civilizations, that luscious mane on your head wasn't just for keeping your ears warm or looking fabulous for a selfie that hadn't been invented yet. Oh no, it was considered a literal extension of your life force, a conduit for your spiritual energy. Think of Samson, whose strength was inextricably linked to his long, uncut hair, a mainstream historical fact that echoes through millennia. When Delilah snipped his locks, she wasn't just giving him a bad haircut, she was severing his connection to divine power, rendering him weak and vulnerable. This wasn't just a story, it was a reflection of deeply ingrained beliefs. People believed that if you got your hands on someone's hair, you held a piece of their very being, making it potent in spells, curses, or even protective charms. It was almost like a spiritual USB drive, holding all your personal data. Across cultures, from the ancient Egyptians meticulously bearing locks of hair with their dead to ensure a complete journey to the afterlife, to indigenous tribes seeing braids as symbolic of unity and strength, hair was loaded with significance. It wasn't just a quirky tidbit, it was a fundamental aspect of how they understood identity and destiny. Losing hair, then, wasn't just aesthetic, it was an existential crisis. It implied a weakening of the soul, a breach in the spiritual defenses, or a severing from vital cosmic forces. Imagine the sheer terror if your hair started falling out in clumps, not just from stress or a bad shampoo, but from an invisible and malevolent influence. Historians still argue whether the widespread fear of hair loss originated independently in various cultures, or if these beliefs spread through ancient trade routes and cultural exchanges. Was it a universal human instinct to link vital body parts to the soul? Or did the idea travel like a particularly insistent salesperson? You can almost feel the chill in the air of an ancient village as a child. Once vibrant begins to lose her hair, the elders wouldn't just prescribe a topical ointment. Oh, no. Their minds would immediately jump to spiritual attacks, malevolent spirits, or perhaps even a curse cast by an envious neighbor. The idea of hair as a spiritual antenna meant that any disruption to its natural state was akin to static on the line, a sign that something unholy was trying to jam your connection to the divine. You'd probably find yourself surrounded by concerned villagers, chanting, burning herbs, and looking at you with a mixture of pity and terror, wondering if you were already halfway to becoming a vessel for something dark. It wasn't a medical mystery, it was a spiritual emergency. And for them, in a world without dermatologists or trichologists, the most logical explanation for such a profound physical change had to be rooted in the supernatural. Because what else could cause such a terrifying transformation? So, you're now steeped in this ancient world where your hair is less about aesthetics and more about your literal lifeline to the universe. Now, let's fast forward a bit, carrying this deeply spiritual view of hair into the realms of early monotheistic thought, particularly as it began to crystallize in what would become the Old Testament. Here you encounter a different, yet equally potent, connection between physical appearance, divine favor, and yes, even potential curses. Baldness or hair loss in many instances, isn't just an unfortunate genetic lottery, it's a visible symbol, often of divine displeasure or impurity. Think about it: if Samson's hair was a sign of his strength and God's blessing, what would its absence signify? You see this fear woven into the very fabric of early religious law. Consider the Levitical texts, which lay out meticulous guidelines for ritual purity. If someone developed a skin ailment that affected their scalp, causing hair to fall out, they weren't just sent to a doctor, they were often declared unclean. This wasn't a casual judgment. It meant separation from the community, inability to participate in religious rites, and a general state of spiritual ostracization. It's a mainstream historical fact that these purity laws were incredibly strict, and any deviation from perceived physical wholeness could be interpreted as a sign of something amiss, something that might even invite malevolent spirits or demonic influence. It was less about a rash and more about a rupture in your spiritual shield. And then there's the story of Elisha and the taunting youths. Remember that rather unsettling tale where some youngsters mock Elisha for his baldness, and in response, two bears emerge from the woods and maul 42 of them. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit, certainly, but it highlights just how sensitive and charged the issue of baldness could be. It wasn't merely an insult, it was an affront to a prophet, and the divine response was swift and brutal. This story, whether literal or allegorical, reinforces the notion that baldness, particularly when associated with figures of authority or spiritual significance, carried an immense weight. It certainly wasn't something to joke about. Unless you fancied a close encounter with some very grumpy bears, you can almost hear the nervous chuckles of those who heard the tale, quickly checking their own receding hairlines. But what about actual demonic possession? In these early narratives, while explicit links between hair loss and demonic presence are less direct than later medieval interpretations, the groundwork is certainly laid. If physical imperfections, especially those as visible as hair loss, could signify divine displeasure or ritual impurity, it wasn't a huge leap to connect them to other forms of spiritual affliction, including the insidious whispers of demons. After all, if God could manifest his wrath through physical signs, couldn't the adversary do the same? Historians still argue whether the concept of demonic possession as a distinct malady, as opposed to simply being cursed or spiritually impure, fully developed in this period, or if it was a gradual evolution influenced by later theological developments. Was it an immediate fear, or did the demonic element creep in over centuries? Like that persistent little weed in your garden, you're standing at the edge of a new understanding, where the physical body becomes a battleground for spiritual forces. A patchy scalp isn't just a sign of aging, it's a potential invitation to something far darker. The terror wasn't just in the loss of hair itself, but in what that loss implied about your standing with the divine, or worse, your vulnerability to the infernal. Imagine the whispers in the marketplace, the sidelong glances at anyone with a visible physical imperfection. Were they just unwell, or had they been marked? The implications were profound, and the fear was palpable. You'd probably find yourself meticulously checking your reflection, not for vanity's sake, but for signs of a far more terrifying kind of decay. You're carrying this deep-seated anxiety about physical imperfections, particularly hair loss, as you step from the ancient Near East into the grandeur, and often equally superstitious, world of ancient Rome. The Romans, despite their reputation for practical engineering and sophisticated law, were far from immune to supernatural beliefs, and their views on baldness were a fascinating blend of jest, social commentary, and, yes, whispers of ill omen. While you won't find direct edicts linking a receding hairline to demonic possession in the Roman archives, you'll discover a society that was highly attuned to appearances and deeply influenced by omens and portents. A mainstream historical fact, baldness, or calvities, was often a subject of humor and mockery in Roman comedies and satires. Think of the poet Martial, who frequently poked fun at baldness, or Caesar, famously sensitive about his own lack of hair. often attempting to conceal it with a laurel wreath. This wasn't just about vanity. A full head of hair was associated with youth, vigor, and virility. To lose it, especially prematurely, could be seen as a sign of declining power or even a lack of favor from the gods. You can almost hear the toga-clad, stand-up comedians of the day, delivering zingers about Senator so-and-so's shiny pate, while the audience nervously patted their own coiffures. But beyond the jokes, there was a subtler undercurrent of unease. Romans were obsessed with divination and the interpretation of signs. They read omens in everything from the flight of birds to the entrails of sacrificial animals. So, if a physical change as noticeable as sudden hair loss occurred, especially in someone prominent, it wouldn't just be laughed off, it could be seen as a prodigium, an unusual event signaling divine displeasure or foretelling misfortune. It was a quirky tidbit of Roman life. They had public officials called augurs, whose entire job was to interpret these signs. Imagine reporting to work, and your task for the day is to figure out if your neighbor's sudden bald spot means the harvest will fail. Historians still argue whether the Roman concept of maleficium, harmful magic, or sorcery truly extended to causing physical ailments like hair loss as a direct act of dark magic, or if it was more about love charms and curses on rivals. While they didn't have the same developed concept of pervasive demonic entities as later Christian theology, they certainly believed in malevolent spirits, curses, and the evil eye that could bring about misfortune or physical blight. So, if your hair started falling out, you might first suspect a jealous rival had paid a sorcerer, rather than a demon being directly involved. But the outcome, a physical affliction linked to unseen, malevolent forces, had a similar flavor of dread. You're navigating a world where a bad haircut could be fixed, but a bad omen from your hair loss that required more than just a trip to the local barber. It demanded introspection, perhaps a visit to a temple, or even a counter curse. The fear wasn't about being possessed in the classic sense, but about being cursed, about having your fortunes reversed or your health undermined by unseen, hostile influences. Losing your hair could mark you not just as a figure of jest, but as someone touched by misfortune, someone whose vitality was ebbing, someone whose future was perhaps already written in the lost strands on their pillow. It's a reminder that even in an empire built on logic and law, the whispers of superstition were never far away, clinging to everyday anxieties, even those as seemingly trivial as a bald spot. You've journeyed through ancient fears and Roman anxieties, and now you're stepping into the medieval period. A time often characterized by profound faith, rigid social structures, and an undeniable fear of the unseen. Here, the landscape of belief shifts dramatically, and the connection between physical ailments, including hair loss, and divine will or demonic influence becomes far more explicit and deeply ingrained. In this era, everything was interpreted through a theological lens. Good fortune was a sign of God's blessing, and misfortune, especially illness or deformity, was often seen as a one divine judgment for sins, either committed by the individual or their ancestors. This worldview, a mainstream historical fact, permeated every aspect of life. If you suddenly started losing your hair, it wasn't just a medical puzzle, it was a spiritual interrogation. What sin have I committed? Am I being punished? These were the immediate, terrifying questions that would plague your mind. It was a cruel irony the more anxious you became about your hair loss, the more hair you might lose, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of fear and perceived guilt. The church, the dominant institution of the time, often reinforced these beliefs, seeing itself as the arbiter of divine will and the protector against spiritual malevolence. Consider the various plagues and widespread diseases that ravaged medieval Europe. When people saw widespread suffering and death, for which they had no scientific explanation, they turned to the only framework they understood: the spiritual. A particularly virulent disease that caused skin lesions or hair loss might be interpreted not just as a punishment, but as the work of the devil or his minions. It was a quirky tidbit of the era that some folk remedies for ailments, including those affecting hair, involved chanting prayers or invoking saints, clearly demonstrating the belief that the cause was spiritual rather than purely physical. Why bother with herbs if a demon was literally pulling out your hair? Historians still argue whether the medieval concept of sin directly caused physical ailments like hair loss in the popular imagination, or if the ailments were merely indicators of an already sinful state. Was the baldness itself the punishment, or just a billboard advertising your spiritual failings? Regardless, the result was the same profound anxiety and a desperate search for spiritual absolution. You'd probably find yourself spending more time in confession, offering penance, and praying for deliverance from both your physical affliction and the perceived spiritual malady. The fear wasn't just of losing your hair, it was of losing your soul, with your thinning scalp serving as a constant, visible reminder of your precarious position. You're living in a world where disease wasn't just disease, it was a cosmic message. Your body wasn't just flesh and bone, it was a canvas upon which divine favor or divine wrath could be dramatically painted. So, if your hair started to thin, you weren't thinking about minoxidil, you were thinking about absolution. You were wondering if a demon had whispered a curse in your ear, or if God himself had decided to mark you. This profound spiritual interpretation of physical symptoms, including something as seemingly mundane as hair loss, set the stage for even deeper fears as the centuries progressed and the shadows of witchcraft and outright demonic possession loomed larger. You've just navigated the spiritual anxieties of the medieval age, where every cough, every ache, and especially every lost strand of hair felt like a missive from the heavens or the infernal depths. Now, imagine a shadow falling over Europe, a darkness so profound it would reshape society, beliefs, and the very perception of the human body, the Black Death. This cataclysmic plague, which swept across the continent in the mid-14th century, didn't just kill millions, it amplified existing fears to a fever pitch, making people even more susceptible to seeing unusual bodily changes as signs of supernatural intervention. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Black Death utterly shattered medieval society's understanding of health and disease. Doctors, son, what few there were, had no effective treatments, and the sheer scale of death defied any rational explanation. In this vacuum of medical knowledge, people turned even more desperately to spiritual interpretations. If God was punishing humanity on such a grand scale, surely individual afflictions, like sudden hair loss, were also part of this divine wrath, or worse, direct attacks from the devil and his legions. Delighting in human suffering, you can almost feel the pervasive dread, the constant sense that the end times were nigh, and every symptom was a grim herald. The plague itself presented a terrifying array of symptoms, from the telltale buboes to fevers and chills, while direct, widespread hair loss wasn't a primary symptom of the bubonic plague itself. The extreme stress, malnutrition, and other associated illnesses like typhus, which often accompanied plague outbreaks, could certainly lead to telogen effluvium, a type of temporary hair loss. So, for those who survived the initial onslaught, only to find their hair thinning or falling out, it must have been a profoundly unsettling and deeply symbolic experience. This becomes a quirky tidbit. The psychological and secondary physical effects of the plague contributed to and were then interpreted through a pre-existing lens of supernatural fear. Imagine surviving the Grim Reaper's dance, only to find your hair abandoning ship, making you wonder if a different kind of darkness was now claiming you. Historians still argue whether the increase in accusations of witchcraft and demonic activity in the late medieval and early modern periods was a direct consequence of the Black Death's psychological trauma, or if these phenomena were on a separate, parallel trajectory. Regardless, the plague years undeniably created an atmosphere where any deviation from the norm, any inexplicable physical change, was ripe for sinister interpretation. If a neighbor developed a patch of baldness, was it just illness? Or had they made a pact with a demon to spare their family from the plague? Such suspicions would have festered in the terrified communities. You're living in a world where the air itself felt heavy with death and spiritual malice. The very ground you walked on was stained with graves in your own body. Even if it had survived the immediate pestilence, felt profoundly vulnerable. Any new symptom, any physical oddity, sent shivers down your spine. Hair loss, in this context, wasn't just a sign of stress or illness, it was potentially a mark of sin, yes, but increasingly, a mark of something more insidious, a devil's kiss, a sign of demonic influence, or a prelude to possession. The stage was set for a far more direct and terrifying link between physical changes and the infernal. You've survived the plague, or at least you're imagining yourself in its grim aftermath, where death and spiritual dread hang heavy in the air. This oppressive atmosphere, coupled with lingering medieval anxieties about divine punishment, created fertile ground for the escalating phenomenon of witchcraft hysteria. In this new phase, the focus sharpened. Physical abnormalities were no longer just signs of divine displeasure, but increasingly direct evidence of a pact with the devil or of demonic interference. The body itself became a text, waiting to be read for infernal clues. It's a mainstream historical fact that the period from the 15th to the 18th centuries saw an explosion of witch trials across Europe and later, colonial America. Accusations weren't just based on strange behavior. They often hinged on physical traits. If you looked different, if your body bore any marks that couldn't be easily explained, you became a suspect. The constant fear of demonic possession and witchcraft meant that people were meticulously scrutinizing each other, looking for any sign, no matter how small or innocent, that might betray an unholy alliance. Imagine living in a village where your neighbor's slightly unusual birthmark could send them to the stake. Within this climate of paranoia, the body was examined with intense, often perverse, scrutiny. Accused witches were stripped and searched for devil's marks, indelible signs believed to be left by Satan to seal a pact. These marks could be anything from moles, scars, or indeed, unusual patches of skin or areas of hair loss. Hidin, a quirky tidbit is that witch prickers were employed to find these marks, often using long needles to probe any suspected blemish. If the spot didn't bleed or didn't cause pain, it was considered proof of a demonic pact, because the devil was thought to numb the area he touched. So, if you had a small, insensitive patch of skin on your scalp where your hair had mysteriously vanished, you were in serious trouble. Historians still argue whether the increased focus on physical marks in witch trials was a deliberate tactic to provide tangible evidence for convictions, or if it genuinely reflected a deeply held popular belief about the devil's physical imprints. Was it manipulation or true conviction? Regardless, the impact was terrifying. You might find yourself dreading the simple act of brushing your hair, fearing what new patch might appear, what new mark might suddenly be revealed, sealing your grim fate. The loss of hair, in this context, wasn't just a private concern, it was a public liability, potentially marking you as an instrument of evil. You are now in an era where your physical being is under constant surveillance, not just by your neighbors, but by the very forces of justice and faith. The loss of hair isn't just a sign of illness or age, it's a potential accusation, a visible sign that your soul might be enthralled to the Prince of Darkness. This relentless search for physical evidence of the demonic would only intensify, pushing the boundaries of paranoia and weaving hair, or its absence, even deeper into the tapestry of supernatural fear. You're deep in the grip of the early modern period, where the scent of fear hangs heavy and the line between physical anomaly and demonic influence blurs. Having explored how witchcraft hysteria turned bodily marks into damning evidence, let's now delve into the broader, mystical properties attributed to hair itself, beyond just its loss. For centuries, across countless cultures, hair wasn't just dead protein. It was a potent ingredient, a connection, a channel for magic, both good and ill. This belief system only intensified the terror when hair disappeared without a logical explanation. It's a mainstream historical fact that hair, particularly human hair, was a common component in folk magic and rituals throughout history, from ancient love spells that incorporated a lock of a beloved's hair to protective charms woven with strands from a child's head. The idea was consistent. A piece of a person's hair held an intrinsic part of their essence. It was like a miniature, portable version of their soul. This meant that if a malicious practitioner got hold of your hair, they could, theoretically, work magic directly upon you, whether to curse you with illness, bind your will, or, yes, even cause your hair to fall out as a tangible sign of their dark influence. You can imagine the paranoia sweeping up stray hairs became a clandestine operation, lest they fall into the wrong hands. This takes us to a particularly quirky tidbit: some medieval and early modern grimoires, books of magic, explicitly describe rituals for causing physical harm or misfortune through the manipulation of a target's personal effects, including their hair. Imagine a disgruntled neighbor or a scorned lover gathering a few strands from your comb, not for a souvenir, but to invoke a spell that would leave you bald or sickly. The fear wasn't just of spontaneous, inexplicable hair loss, but of being actively targeted. If you woke up with a bald patch, your first thought might not be a medical condition, but rather, who has my hair and what did they do with it? Historians still argue whether these specific hair-based curses were widely practiced by alleged witches, or if they were largely theoretical constructs found in demonological treatises written by the accusers themselves. Was the fear a reflection of actual magical practices, or a projection of anxieties by those seeking to prove the existence of witchcraft, regardless of its practical application? The belief in hair's magical vulnerability was undeniably pervasive. This meant that any unusual change to your hair, especially its sudden absence, could be seen as the chilling efficacy of a malevolent spell, an attack from unseen forces facilitated by someone who harbored ill will. You're living in a world where every single strand of hair on your head feels like a tiny, vulnerable flag, signaling your identity to the cosmos. To lose it inexplicably was not just a cosmetic issue, it was a breach in your spiritual defenses. It suggested that a piece of you had been weaponized against you, that an evil influence had found a way to literally pluck away your vitality. This profound anxiety about hair's mystical power laid crucial groundwork for the ultimate conclusion that hair loss, when it couldn't be explained by simple aging or visible injury, must be the insidious work of demons, either directly or through their human agents. You've absorbed the potent, often terrifying, belief in hair's mystical power and its vulnerability to dark magic. Now, let's pivot slightly and examine the broader context of non-disease explanation. In the medieval and early modern periods, in a world utterly devoid of germ theory, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of human anatomy beyond what could be observed superficially, people desperately sought answers for affliction. And more often than not, these answers were found not in biology, but in theology. Diseases were widely attributed to demonic influence. This framework made the leap to connecting hair loss with infernal forces practically inevitable. It's a mainstream historical fact that for centuries, before the Enlightenment ushered in scientific revolution, illness was frequently viewed as a spiritual malady. If you fell sick, it wasn't just your body that was ailing, your soul was likely under attack, or you were being punished for sin, or, most terrifyingly, a demon had taken up residence within you, causing your symptoms. People might speak of fever demons or plague spirits because they had no other way to conceptualize the unseen forces causing such devastation. This meant that any unexplained physical symptom, from a persistent cough to, yes, sudden and inexplicable hair loss, could be interpreted as a manifestation of a demonic presence. You can almost feel the stifling air of a sick room, filled not with the smell of medicine, but with the fervent prayers of family trying to cast out unseen entities. Consider a particularly quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts, while attempting to be empirical, often included sections on astrology or demonology as contributing factors to illness. A doctor might prescribe a poultice, but also recommend a pilgrimage or an exorcism just to cover all spiritual bases. The body was seen as porous, susceptible to invasion from spiritual realms. So, if your hair started falling out in clumps, it wasn't just a sign of illness. It was a visible indicator that your internal defenses had been breached, that an unseen entity was literally pulling strings, or rather, hairs from within. The idea was that a demon, residing within you, could manipulate your physical form, and hair loss was just one of its many cruel tricks. Historians still argue whether the primary cause attributed to common illnesses was demonic possession, or if it was more often seen as divine punishment, with demonic influence being a secondary, but equally terrifying possibility. Was the devil the direct culprit, or merely God's instrument of wrath? Regardless, the chilling implication was the same. Your hair loss was not simply biological, it was deeply, terrifyingly spiritual. You'd probably find yourself not just seeking remedies, but urgently seeking out priests, confessors, and perhaps even cunning folk who specialized in warding off evil spirits. The fear wasn't just of being unwell, but of being a vessel, a puppet, for something malevolent. You're seeing how the lack of scientific understanding created a void that was quickly filled by spiritual explanations. When there's no visible germ, no clear infection pathway, the mind naturally turns to the invisible. And in a deeply religious age, that invisible realm was populated by angels and demons, by saints and devils. So hot when your hair began to abandon your scalp without reason, it wasn't a problem for a dermatologist. It was a crisis for a theologian. It cemented the belief that your physical decay was a chilling external sign of a truly internal, demonic struggle. You've absorbed the prevailing belief that disease itself was often a demonic affair. Now, let's narrow our focus from general illness to specific afflictions of the scalp, and how these, more than almost any other physical symptom, became chillingly interpreted as visible signs of Yaruwash inner depravity or demonic touch. Imagine the horror: your very skin, your very hair, betraying your soul's supposed corruption. It's a mainstream historical fact that skin conditions, particularly those that cause disfigurement, itching, or hair loss, were viewed with immense suspicion in medieval and early modern societies. Conditions like ringworm, tinea capitis, severe psoriasis, or even advanced cases of lice infestations, which can lead to significant hair breakage and patchy baldness, had no known cures or even clear explanations. They were chronic, often unsightly, and sometimes contagious. In an era where hygiene was rudimentary and medical understanding even more so, these conditions weren't just uncomfortable, they were profoundly unsettling and deeply symbolic. You can almost feel the instinctive recoil of people who saw someone with a scaly, bald patch, wondering if it was catching, not just physically, but spiritually. This brings us to a particularly quirky tidbit. Some folk beliefs held that certain skin conditions, especially those with an unpleasant odor or persistent irritation, were literally devil scratch marks or demonic bites. The idea was that a demon, having gained access to your person, would leave its signature, a physical manifestation of its vile presence. If a person, particularly one accused of witchcraft or suspected of consorting with evil, suddenly developed a severe scalp condition leading to hair loss, it was often taken as undeniable proof of their infernal allegiance. The physical decay was seen as a mirroring of their spiritual decay, a visible sign that their soul was festering with wickedness, or that a demon had taken root within them. Historians still argue whether the interpretation of common skin diseases as devil's marks was primarily a top-down imposition by authorities seeking to justify witch hunts, or a genuinely widespread belief among the populace stemming from deeply rooted fears and lack of scientific explanation. Was it propaganda or genuine terror? Regardless, the effect was devastating. If you had an unsightly rash on your scalp that caused your hair to fall out, you might find yourself not just battling the physical discomfort, but fighting for your reputation, your freedom, and even your life. The shame and fear would have been immense. You're now seeing how deeply intertwined the physical and spiritual realms were in the minds of people from this era. Your scalp wasn't just skin, it was a canvas for condemnation. The loss of hair, particularly when accompanied by other dermatological issues, was no longer a simple medical problem. It was a terrifying pronouncement. Your soul was perhaps stained, your body corrupted, and a demonic entity was quite possibly manifesting its evil right there on your head. This direct visual link to sin and the demonic made hair loss an incredibly potent and fear-inducing symptom. You've just peered into the chilling link between scalp ailments and perceived spiritual decay. Now let's go directly to the heart of the matter, demonic possession itself, and how the historical accounts of this terrifying phenomenon frequently included drastic, inexplicable physical alterations, with hair changes often taking center stage. If a demon could twist a body into unnatural contortions, speak with strange voices, or imbue supernatural strength, then surely it could just as easily manipulate something as seemingly minor, yet symbolically vital, as your hair. It's a mainstream historical fact that descriptions of demonic possession throughout the medieval and early modern periods are remarkably consistent across various accounts, from ecclesiastical records to popular pamphlets. These narratives often feature a litany of horrifying symptoms: convulsions, speaking in tongues or unknown languages, supernatural knowledge, aversion to holy objects, and crucially, physical changes that defied natural explanation. The possessed person's body was seen as a battleground, contorted and warped by the internal struggle between the demonic entity and the trapped soul. You can almost hear the terrified gasps of onlookers as someone's hair, perhaps previously neat and orderly, suddenly became wild, matted, or worse, started falling out in clumps before their very eyes. A particularly quirky tidbit is the detailed, almost forensic descriptions found in some demonological treatises of the physical effects of possession. These texts, often compiled by inquisitors or theologians, meticulously cataloged every possible sign of demonic influence. Hair becoming coarse, thin, falling out in patches, or even changing color spontaneously were all listed as potential indicators. The logic was chillingly simple. If the demon could take over the mind, it could certainly exert control over the body's less vital functions. Imagine being the subject of such an examination. Every strand of your hair scrutinized for signs of infernal meddling. Every shed hair a potential mark against your soul. It's less about a bad hair day and more about a bad eternal destination. Historians still argue whether these dramatic physical manifestations, including hair changes, were genuinely observed symptoms, perhaps psychosomatic responses to extreme stress and belief, or if they were largely embellished or fabricated details to fit the prevailing theological narratives of possession. Were people genuinely witnessing hair fall out, or were they expecting to see it, thereby interpreting any slight change through that terrifying lens? Regardless, the belief was potent enough to shape perceptions and influence outcomes, particularly in the context of exorcisms and witch trials. You'd probably find yourself not only fearing possession for your soul's sake, but also for the very physical integrity of your body, including your precious locks. You're standing at the precipice of absolute terror, where your own body can become a prison and a canvas for demonic activity. The idea that a demon could literally pull your hair from your head, strand by horrifying strand, was not just a metaphor, it was a visceral, horrifying possibility. This tangible, visible sign of internal struggle made hair loss a truly potent and terrifying indicator, cementing its place as a classic, if often overlooked, symptom in the chilling lore of demonic possession. You've just glimpsed the terrifying physical manifestations of demonic possession, where every aspect of the body could become a puppet for unseen evil. Now, with the stage set by widespread belief in witchcraft and possession, let's confront the grim reality of the Inquisition's interrogations and their relentless search for markings, including those on the scalp, that served as damning evidence of an unholy pact. This was not just about diagnosing possession. It was about proving a direct alliance with the devil, and every part of your body was under suspicion. It's a mainstream historical fact that the various inquisitions, particularly the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, employed systematic methods of interrogation to extract confessions from those suspected of heresy, witchcraft, or diabolism. Part of this process involved meticulous physical examinations of the accused, searching for any unusual marks or blemishes that could be interpreted as a devil's mark or a witch's mark. These marks were believed to be places where the devil had touched his supplicant, sealing their pact, or where a familiar spirit might suckle. You can almost feel the cold dread as you imagine yourself being stripped and scrutinized under harsh, unforgiving eyes, knowing that a simple mole could be your undoing. A particularly quirky tidbit is the belief that these marks were often insensible to pain, or that they would not bleed when pricked. This led to the use of prickers, individuals, sometimes women, who would use long pins or needles to poke and prod any suspicious blemish on the accused's body. If the area didn't react, it was considered conclusive proof. Imagine the horror if a patch of hair loss on your scalp, perhaps from a simple skin condition or even stress, was subjected to such a test. If that area happened to be numb due to nerve damage, or if the pricker was simply skilled at avoiding sensitive spots, you were essentially condemned. Your missing hair wasn't just a sign of demonic influence. It was a target for a deadly medieval medical exam. Historians still argue whether the inquisitors genuinely believed in the literal interpretation of these devil's marks as physical proof, or if the concept was employed as a psychological tool to break down the accused and elicit confessions. Was it sincere theological conviction, or a pragmatic method of torture and coercion? Regardless, the outcomes were horrifyingly real. You'd probably find yourself scrutinizing your own body in secret, terrified of discovering any unexplainable mark, especially on your scalp, knowing it could lead to torture, confession, and execution. The fear of hair loss intensified because it wasn't just a physical change, but a potential death sentence. You're now experiencing the peak of paranoia, where the body itself was a legal document, and every imperfection was a potential clause in a devil's contract. The belief that hair loss could be a devil's mark, an infernal brand, elevated a common physical ailment into an object of profound terror in official scrutiny. This systematic search for physical evidence solidified the notion that a missing patch of hair wasn't just unfortunate, it was a literal sign of a direct relationship with evil, making the victim not just afflicted, but actively complicit in their own torment. You've just been subjected to the chilling scrutiny of the Inquisition, where every mole and patch of skin, especially on the scalp, could be read as a devil's grim signature. Now, let's take a breath and pivot to a fascinating, paradoxical counterpoint within the medieval period, the concept of baldness as a hermit's virtue. This wasn't about demonic influence, but quite the opposite, a deliberate embrace of hair loss as a sign of spiritual devotion and detachment from worldly vanity. It offers a crucial contrast to the prevailing fears we've been exploring. It's a mainstream historical fact that many ascetic religious orders, particularly monks, friars, and hermits, practiced a ritual known as the tonsure Eid. This involved shaving a part of the scalp, usually the crown, leaving a ring of hair around it. This practice, while not exactly causing baldness, was a deliberate act of removing hair, symbolizing humility, renunciation of worldly pride, and dedication to God. It was a visual cue, signaling their commitment to a life beyond material concerns and vanity. You can almost see the smooth, shining pates of these devout men, starkly contrasting with the flowing locks valued by secular society. This offers a quirky tidbit. While secular society might view baldness as unfortunate or even a potential sign of ill omen, within these spiritual contexts, it was a mark of honor. It was a physical manifestation of choosing the spiritual over the superficial. A monk's tonsure wasn't just a haircut, it was a profound declaration for a hermit whose life was one of extreme self-denial and isolation. Any natural hair loss might even be seen as a further, unplanned blessing, another sign that their body was withering away in devotion, unconcerned with earthly appearances. Imagine the internal conflict for a man entering a monastery with a full head of hair, deliberately choosing to shave it off, knowing that outside those walls, such a physical state might invite suspicion. Historians still argue whether the practice of tonsure genuinely fostered a different social perception of natural baldness within monastic communities, or if the specific ritual act was so distinct from natural hair loss that the broader stigma remained. Did the tonsure truly normalize baldness in any general sense, or was it an exception that proved the rule regardless? It provides a fascinating glimpse into how context utterly transformed the meaning of hair loss. You'd probably find yourself marveling at this dichotomy. The same physical state could be either a mark of the divine or a mark of the demonic, depending entirely on the narrative woven around it. You're seeing that while fear and superstition often painted hair loss in dark hues, there existed this parallel tradition where it was embraced, even cultivated, as a sign of piety. This distinction highlights the deep symbolic power attributed to hair, its presence, its absence, and its deliberate manipulation. It underscores that while the terror of demonic hair loss was real and pervasive, there were always subtle, sometimes contradictory, currents flowing beneath the surface of popular belief, reminding us that even in the darkest ages, human interpretation was complex and multifaceted. You've just explored the surprising spiritual virtue of baldness in ascetic traditions, a stark contrast to its fearful interpretations. Now let's widen our lens to encompass other bini, symbolic haircutting rituals, practices that, while often for benevolent purposes, nonetheless underscored the belief that severing or altering hair held profound spiritual implications, making involuntary hair loss even more ominous. These rituals, whether for purification, mourning, or protection, reinforced the idea that hair was a powerful medium, capable of being manipulated by unseen forces. It's a mainstream historical fact that haircutting has been a significant ritual across numerous cultures for millennia. Beyond the monastic tonsure, practices like shaving one's head in mourning for the dead, or a bride cutting her hair as a symbol of transitioning to a new life stage, were common. These acts were never merely cosmetic, they were deeply symbolic, representing a break with the past, an act of purification, or a dedication to a new state. The very act of cutting hair was understood to release, or at least alter, a part of one's spiritual essence. You can almost feel the solemnity of such moments, where each snip of the scissors felt like a severance from the old self. This leads us to a particularly quirky tidbit in some folk traditions. Specific haircutting rituals were performed to ward off evil or protect against curses. For example, a child's first haircut might be accompanied by charms or prayers to ensure their future well-being and protect them from malevolent spirits. Or, if someone felt they were under a curse, a ritualistic cutting of their hair might be performed to cut away the negative influence. This practice highlights the belief that hair could serve as a tether for evil, and removing it was a way of breaking that connection. Imagine the desperate hope of someone suffering from inexplicable ailments, believing that a quick snip of their hair could release them from a demonic grip. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of ritual hair cutting contributed to, or perhaps even alleviated, the fear associated with involuntary hair loss. Did these rituals make people more comfortable with the idea of hair manipulation? Or did they simply underscore how potent and vulnerable hair was, thus intensifying fears when it fell out uncontrollably? Regardless, the consensus was clear: hair was not just hair. It was a spiritual lightning rod, capable of attracting or repelling unseen forces. You'd probably find yourself pondering the sheer weight placed upon something so seemingly mundane, realizing that every strand held immense symbolic value. Your understanding that the cultural reverence for hair, seen in these deliberate rituals, created a stark and terrifying contrast to its sudden, inexplicable disappearance. If people willingly cut their hair for profound spiritual reasons, then its involuntary loss, especially in patches or clumps, could only be interpreted as an equally profound, but malignant, spiritual event. It wasn't just losing hair. It was an unchosen, unwelcome ritual performed upon you by dark forces, a terrifying sign that something malevolent had taken a piece of your essence without your consent. You've just witnessed how deeply symbolic haircutting rituals were, reinforcing the idea that hair held profound spiritual power. Now, let's turn our attention to the fascinating and often frustrating realm of medical superstition and diagnosis. In the medieval and early modern periods, in a world before clinical trials and germ theory, early medical practitioners often mixed rudimentary observation with deeply ingrained superstitious beliefs, making the diagnosis of hair loss a perplexing blend of physical symptoms and perceived spiritual causes. It's a mainstream historical fact that what passed for medicine for centuries was a complex amalgam of humoral theory, balancing bodily fluids like blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, astrology, herbalism, and often religious and magical practices. A physician might consult star charts, examine your urine, and then prescribe a concoction of herbs, alongside recommending prayers or a visit to a local saint's shrine, when confronted with something like hair loss, particularly if it was sudden and widespread. Their diagnostic framework struggled to find a purely physical explanation. They didn't have the vocabulary for autoimmune diseases or nutritional deficiencies, so their minds often drifted to less tangible culprits. You can almost imagine a worried patient, their scalp patchy, listening intently as a learned doctor consults a dusty tome filled with both herbal remedies and astrological predictions. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit some early medical treatises, while attempting to classify diseases, would often include sections dedicated to afflictions caused by melancholy or distempers of the humors that could manifest as hair loss. But these humoral imbalances were themselves often linked to moral failings or even subtle demonic influences. So, while they might offer a physical explanation, the underlying cause could still be rooted in the spiritual. For instance, an excess of black bile melancholy was thought to cause dark moods, and sometimes physical decay, including hair loss. But how did one get an excess of black bile? Perhaps through a life of sin or a curse. It was a convenient loop. The physical problem led back to a spiritual origin. Historians still argue whether the medical community of the time genuinely saw superstition and religious belief as integral parts of their diagnostic process, or if they merely catered to popular anxieties while secretly pursuing more empirical, for their time observations. Did they truly believe in the demonic origins of some ailments? Or was it a useful framework for explaining the unexplainable to a deeply superstitious populace? Regardless, if you presented with sudden hair loss, your medical professional might not just check your humors. They might also inquire about recent sins, strange dreams, or any perceived curses from neighbors, because every avenue had to be explored. You're seeing how the limited scientific understanding of the human body left enormous gaps, which were readily filled by spiritual and superstitious explanations. Your hair, shedding inexplicably, wasn't just a dermatological issue. It became a diagnostic challenge that inevitably led down a path toward the supernatural. The inability to offer a coherent, physical reason for hair loss only strengthened the existing cultural narrative that something unseen, something malignant, was at play, ultimately pushing the explanation firmly into the realm of demonic influence. You've just navigated the fascinating, often confusing, blend of early medicine and entrenched superstition. Now let's immerse ourselves even more deeply in the popular imagination, exploring the rich and often terrifying folklore of hair and evil spirits. These were the stories whispered by the hearth, the cautionary tales that shaped how common people understood their bodies and the unseen forces that could afflict them, cementing the fear that hair abnormalities were deeply linked to malevolent entities. It's a mainstream historical fact that across Europe, local folk traditions, legends, and superstitions often depicted spirits, witches, and other malevolent beings interacting with humans through their hair. Hair wasn't just a part of the body. It was a potent point of vulnerability, a gateway. Think of the striga or witch in Romanian folklore, often depicted as a nocturnal being that could literally suck the life force out of sleeping victims, sometimes leaving them weakened and physically altered. While not always directly linked to hair loss, the concept of spirits physically interacting with the human form and leaving a mark was pervasive. You can almost feel the chill wind through a creaky window at night and instinctively pull your blankets higher, fearing what might be out there, seeking a stray lock of your hair. This leads us to a particularly quirky tidbit. Some specific European folktales explicitly describe certain hair abnormalities, or sudden hair loss, as the direct result of an encounter with a malevolent spirit or a curse. For example, stories existed of mischievous sprites or vengeful ghosts that would tangle hair so severely it had to be cut off. Or even, in more sinister versions, cause patches of hair to vanish overnight. The idea was that these entities weren't just content to scare you. They wanted to leave a lasting, physical reminder of their presence, a calling card of torment. Imagine waking up to find a perfectly round patch of your hair gone, as if an invisible cookie cutter had been applied to your scalp. Your mind wouldn't jump to alopecia areata. It would jump straight to the little imps or fey creatures your grandmother warned you about. Historians still argue whether these folk beliefs were independent of formal theological demonology, or if they were popular interpretations and simplifications of more complex theological ideas about evil. Did the common people come up with these stories themselves? Or were they trickle-down versions of what priests and scholars preached about demons? Regardless, these stories reinforce the idea that hair was a prime target for malevolent forces. You'd probably find yourself eyeing your reflection with a newfound suspicion, convinced that every knot or split end was a testament to the night's unseen visitors, let alone an actual bald patch. You're now fully immersed in the grassroots level of fear, where the supernatural wasn't just an abstract concept for theologians. It was a tangible, ever-present threat lurking in the woods, under your bed, or even, terrifyingly, in your own hair. These folk beliefs, passed down through generations, solidified the link between hair abnormalities and the active, physical interference of evil spirits. When someone suffered from inexplicable hair loss, it wasn't just a personal misfortune, it was a public sign that they had been touched by something dark, making them an object of fear, pity, and often ostracism. You've just been introduced to the terrifying folk beliefs where mischievous or downright malicious spirits could physically manifest their evil by manipulating your hair. Now, let's turn to an even more sinister corner of medieval and early modern lore, the legends surrounding the devil's claws and missing hair. These stories weren't just about general evil spirits. They focused on the supreme malevolent entity himself, or his direct demonic servants, and their chilling habit of literally plucking, tearing, or altering hair as a mark of their presence or power. It's a mainstream historical fact that across many European traditions, the devil and his demons were often depicted with sharp claws, talons, or even fiery hands, capable of inflicting physical harm and leaving indelible marks. These weren't just abstract concepts of evil. They were often given tangible, terrifying forms in art, sermons, and popular stories. The idea was that if you encountered such a being, or if it had some influence over you, it wouldn't just whisper temptations. It would leave a physical calling card, a mark of its vile touch. You can almost feel the phantom itch on your scalp, wondering if you'd somehow incurred the wrath of something truly ancient and wicked. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit. Some accounts of demonic encounters or possession specifically mentioned hair being pulled out, matted, or even singed as a direct result of the demon's presence. Imagine a person writhing in what was believed to be a fit of possession, and during the struggle, clumps of their hair are inexplicably torn out, or patches appear suddenly smooth and bald, as if seared clean. In these scenarios, the missing hair wasn't just a symptom, it was seen as concrete evidence of the demon's physical interference, a visible sign of its strength and malevolence. It was as if the demon, in its fury, literally grabbed hold of your essence and ripped it away, leaving a bald spot as a chilling trophy. You'd probably find yourself meticulously checking your reflection after a bad dream, just to ensure no unseen talons had left their mark. Historians still argue whether these specific depictions of hair manipulation by demons were common embellishments by those recording possession accounts, seeking to make the stories more dramatic and terrifying, or if they reflected genuine, albeit psychosomatic, physical reactions in individuals under extreme stress or belief. Were they literary devices or actual observations? Regardless, the narratives were pervasive and deeply unsettling. The fear wasn't just of being possessed, but of being physically marked by the experience, carrying a literal branding of infernal contact on your very head. You're now squarely in the realm where the physical body becomes an undeniable battleground, and hair, that outward symbol of vitality, becomes a key indicator of a supernatural assault. The chilling possibility that the devil himself, or one of his direct agents, could reach out with a clawed hand and pluck away your hair made unexplained baldness a terrifying, tangible link to the ultimate evil. It was a sign that your body, and by extension, your soul, was actively being tormented by forces beyond human comprehension. You've just been introduced to the terrifying notion of the devil's literal, clawed touch leaving its mark on your scalp. Building on this, let's consider another terrifying aspect, the sheer shock and horror associated with sudden hair loss. While chronic, gradual thinning might invite concern, the abrupt and unexplained loss of hair, sometimes overnight, was particularly alarming and baffling to people who lacked modern medical understanding, making it ripe for supernatural interpretations. It's a mainstream historical fact that the human body was, for the most part, a mystery in pre-modern times. While obvious injuries or fevers had visible causes, internal processes and chronic conditions were perplexing. When something as visible and symbolically charged as hair suddenly abandoned the scalp without a clear physical trauma, no obvious wound, no burning, no known illness, it defied all logic. This inexplicable nature made it profoundly unsettling. You can almost feel the cold dread of someone running their hand over their head in the morning, only for a handful of hair to come away, leaving a smooth, stark patch where it once was. Their immediate thought wouldn't be autoimmune condition. It would be, what unseen force has done this to me? This brings us to a particularly quirky tidbit. Some folk accounts described hair loss occurring during inexplicable fits or seizures, which were often attributed to demonic possession. During these violent episodes, victims might thrash, scream, and experience various physical changes. If, after such a fit, patches of hair were found to be missing, it was taken as irrefutable proof of the demon's violent struggle within the body. The hair wasn't just falling out, it was being ripped or burned by the invisible entity. Imagine a distraught family witnessing such an event, their loved one writhing, and then discovering the physical evidence of the demonic struggle on their scalp. It solidified their terror and fueled their conviction that something truly evil was at play. Historians still argue whether the perceived suddenness of hair loss in these historical accounts was truly as immediate as described, or if it was the sudden realization of pre-existing, perhaps gradual hair loss that then triggered the terrifying interpretation. Was it truly an overnight vanishing act, or the dawning realization of a condition that had been progressing subtly? Regardless, the perception of suddenness amplified the horror, because it implied an instantaneous, powerful, and utterly unnatural intervention. You'd probably find yourself living in constant fear of waking up to such a ghastly surprise, knowing it would signify not just a physical affliction, but a direct attack on your very being by malevolent forces. You're now grasping the full terror of the unexplained. In a world where every natural phenomenon had a spiritual echo, the abrupt loss of something as vital and symbolic as hair was an unignorable scream from the supernatural realm. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a terrifying, undeniable sign that something unseen had laid its violent claim, reinforcing the chilling belief that hair loss was a symptom, and often a consequence, of demonic possession. You've just felt the stark terror of sudden, inexplicable hair loss, a phenomenon utterly bewildering to those without modern medical understanding. This brings us to a more general, yet equally potent, underlying truth of pre-modern existence: the pervasive fear of the unexplained body. When people encountered physical changes, they couldn't rationalize through their limited knowledge. Their minds inevitably gravitated towards supernatural, often sinister explanations. Your body, and usually a predictable companion, could suddenly become alien, a source of profound dread. It's a mainstream historical fact that prior to the scientific revolutions of the Enlightenment, the inner workings of the human body were largely a black box. Illnesses emerged seemingly at random. Afflictions appeared without clear cause, and death struck with terrifying unpredictability. Without germ theory, genetics, or even accurate anatomical knowledge, any deviation from the norm, a strange rash, a persistent tremor, or a patch of hair that simply vanished, was met with a mixture of confusion and fear. People simply lacked the conceptual tools to understand what we now recognize as physiological processes. You can almost imagine the wide-eyed wonder, and then terror, as someone described a spontaneous physical change for which no familiar explanation existed. This lack of understanding fostered a particularly quirky tidbit: the belief that invisible forces, whether divine, demonic, or magical, could directly manipulate the physical form. If you didn't know about autoimmune disorders, then a perfectly round bald spot appearing overnight seemed less like a medical condition and more like the precise work of an unseen entity. Perhaps a demon plucking hairs like a mischievous child pulls petals from a daisy. This wasn't about a spiritual cause of a physical disease. It was about a direct, physical action by a supernatural agent on the body. The hair loss wasn't a symptom, it was the effect of an immediate, non-physical intervention. Historians still argue whether the fear of unexplained bodily changes primarily fueled the belief in demonic possession, or if the pre-existing belief in demons simply provided a ready-made explanation for such phenomena. Was the unexplained leading to demons, or were demons always waiting to explain the unexplained regardless? The result was a pervasive anxiety. You'd probably find yourself living in a state of heightened alert, scrutinizing not just your own body, but those of your family and neighbors, for any sign that the veil between the natural and supernatural had been breached. You're realizing that hair loss, in this context, wasn't just a specific affliction, it was a potent symbol of this larger, terrifying truth: the human body was not entirely your own. It was vulnerable to unseen forces, capable of betraying you with inexplicable symptoms that could only be understood as external manifestations of internal spiritual warfare. This profound unease with the unexplained body cemented hair loss as a deeply unsettling and often demonically attributed phenomenon. You've just grappled with the sheer terror of an unexplained body, a canvas upon which unseen forces could paint their chilling designs. Now let's explore another facet of demonic interaction: the concept of war demonic familiars, animal forms, and how these insidious entities were sometimes thought to be linked to human hair, adding another layer of unsettling connection between the physical body and the infernal. It's a mainstream historical fact that in the era of witchcraft trials, particularly in England and Scotland, the concept of a familiar spirit or familiar gained widespread traction. These were believed to be small, animal-shaped demonic entities that served witches, assisting them in their malevolent acts in exchange for a drop of blood or a piece of their soul. Familiars often took the form of common household animals: cats, dogs, toads, even insects. The belief was that these seemingly innocuous creatures were actually the devil's agents, acting as spies, messengers, or even direct instruments of harm. You can almost feel the shiver of suspicion as a stray cat wandered into a villager's yard, suddenly no longer just an animal, but a potential spy for a dark mistress. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit: some confessions, often extracted under duress, and some demonological texts described how these familiars would suckle from a specific teat or mark on the witch's body, And occasionally, these marks were described as unusual blemishes, patches of discoloration, or even areas of more hair loss. The idea was that the demon, or its familiar, had literally fed upon the witch's essence, leaving a subtle, yet damning, mark. Imagine being accused, then having your body meticulously searched, and a bald patch on your scalp, perhaps due to stress or simple genetics, is suddenly interpreted as the very spot where a demonic toad had been feeding. The very concept is enough to make your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. Historians still argue whether the concept of familiars with physical marks was a genuine popular belief that developed organically, or if it was largely a construct developed by witch hunters and legal authorities to provide tangible evidence during trials. Was it a grassroots fear or a legal fabrication? Regardless, the chilling connection was made. Hair loss could be a sign of a deep, intimate, and horrifyingly physical relationship with a demonic entity, a living testament to a pact with the underworld. You'd probably find yourself eyeing even your most beloved pet with a newfound, terrifying suspicion, wondering if its purr was a prelude to something far more sinister. You're now seeing how the fear of the demonic permeated every aspect of life, even down to the animals people kept and the conditions of their own bodies. The idea that hair loss could signify a witch's familiar having fed upon them was a deeply disturbing thought, turning an unfortunate physical symptom into a sign of active participation in evil. It cemented hair loss as not just a misfortune, but a terrifying brand of complicity, linking the individual directly to the dark forces they so desperately feared. You've just been introduced to the terrifying idea of demonic familiars leaving their mark on your scalp. Now, let's shift to the desperate attempts to combat these infernal forces by exploring exorcism rites and the collection of hair samples. When people believed hair loss was a sign of demonic possession, it was only natural that the very strands of hair might become central to the ritualistic expulsion of evil, either as a diagnostic tool or as a part of the spiritual battle itself. It's a mainstream historical fact that exorcism, the ritualistic expulsion of demons or other evil spiritual entities from a person or place, has been practiced across various religions and cultures for millennia. But it became particularly prominent in the medieval and early modern Christian world. These rites were often elaborate, involving prayers, blessings, holy water, relics, and direct commands to the demon. During these intense rituals, the possessed individual often underwent extreme physical and psychological distress, and any changes to their body, including their hair, were meticulously observed as signs of the demon's presence or its struggle to resist expulsion. You can almost hear the fervent incantations, the terrified screams, and the rustle of robes in a dimly lit room, all focused on a tormented soul. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit in some historical accounts of exorcisms, especially those recorded by eager demonologists or ecclesiastical authorities. Hair samples were occasionally collected or examined, during or after the rite. Why? Because if the hair loss was believed to be a direct physical manifestation of the demon's presence or its activity within the body, then the lost hair itself could be seen as imbued with the demon's essence, or at least a telltale sign of its influence. It might be examined for unusual texture, color changes, or simply its sudden absence, offering proof to the exorcist and observers that a true demonic battle had occurred. Imagine the chilling spectacle of a priest carefully examining a clump of hair, seeking infernal clues within its strands. It was less about DNA and more about demonic identification. Historians still argue whether the collection of such physical evidence during exorcisms was primarily to validate the ritual for observers and authorities, or if it genuinely served a diagnostic purpose for the exorcists themselves, helping them understand the nature of the demonic presence. Was it theatrical validation, or a crude form of spiritual forensics? Regardless, the practice underscores the profound belief that hair loss was a tangible connection to the demonic, an observable symptom that lent credibility to the terrifying claims of possession. You'd probably find yourself hoping that any inexplicable hair loss you experienced would be seen as a minor affliction, rather than a spiritual crisis demanding such a dramatic and potentially dangerous intervention. You're now seeing how hair, in its very absence, became a focal point in the terrifying drama of exorcism. The belief that hair loss was a sign of demonic possession not only fueled the fear, but also shaped the practices of those attempting to combat evil. The shedding strands became unwilling witnesses, silent but potent indicators of an unseen battle being waged within the human body. You've just witnessed how hair, even in its absence, played a role in the dramatic and terrifying rituals of exorcism. Now, let's explore another fascinating dichotomy in the medieval mindset narratives where saints miraculously grew hair while sinners suffered hair loss as punishment. This contrast beautifully illustrates the era's pervasive belief that the body, and especially hair, was a direct barometer of one's spiritual standing with the divine. It's a mainstream historical fact that hagiographies, the biographies of saints, are replete with accounts of miraculous physical transformations. Saints, through their piety and divine favor, were often depicted as transcending natural limitations. For instance, stories abound of saints miraculously recovering from grievous wounds, surviving starvation, or, relevant to our discussion, experiencing supernatural hair growth as a sign of their sanctity or a divine blessing. Imagine the awe of parishioners hearing tales of a holy man whose hair, once sparse, suddenly grew thick and lustrous after a night of fervent prayer, a visible testament to God's grace. This wasn't just good genetics, it was divine affirmation. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit. While saints might miraculously sprout hair, those deemed sinners or possessed by demons would often suffer the inverse. Their hair would thin, fall out, or become disheveled and repulsive. The narrative was clear: a full, well-kept head of hair, unless deliberately tonsured for ascetic reasons, was often associated with health, purity, and divine favor. Its absence, especially when unexplained, signaled moral decay, spiritual corruption, or active demonic influence. It was less about a bad hair day and more about a bad soul day. Historians still argue whether these contrasting narratives were primarily designed as moralizing tales to encourage piety, or if they genuinely reflected popular interpretations of physical symptoms through a spiritual lens. Were they didactic tools or direct observations filtered through faith? You'd probably find yourself scrutinizing the physical appearance of anyone around you, looking for these telling signs. A person with thinning hair, particularly if they had a reputation for ill deeds or strange behavior, would be viewed with deep suspicion. Was their hair loss merely unfortunate, or was it a visible manifestation of divine punishment for their sins? Perhaps even a prelude to, or symptom of, demonic possession? The very idea would send shivers down your spine, making you wonder if your own body held similar telltale signs. You're now fully immersed in a worldview where your physical form, particularly your hair, was an open book for spiritual interpretation. The parallel narratives of miraculous hair growth for the pious and unexplained hair loss for the damned solidified the terrifying connection. If God rewarded faith with physical wholeness, then the devil or divine wrath must punish sin and demonic pacts with physical decay, often visible on the very crown of your head. This profound symbolism made hair loss not just a physical problem, but a terrifying moral and spiritual pronouncement. You've just seen how contrasting narratives of saints and sinners reinforce the symbolic weight of hair growth as divine blessing, loss as spiritual curse. Now, let's consider the surprising and often grim role of barber surgeons. Key. These historical figures occupied a unique, sometimes unsettling position, dealing with everything from a quick shave to battlefield amputations. And in doing so, they inadvertently touched upon the very anxieties we've been discussing, particularly concerning ominous bodily afflictions like hair loss. It's a mainstream historical fact that for centuries, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, the roles of barber and surgeon were often combined. Barbers possessed sharp tools, a steady hand, and an understanding of superficial anatomy, making them uniquely qualified for minor surgical procedures like bloodletting, tooth extraction, and setting simple fractures. In addition to cutting hair and shaving beards, they were often the most accessible medical professionals for the common person, making them privy to all sorts of bodily complaints. You can almost smell the antiseptic, or lack thereof, mixed with the faint scent of hair clippings in their shops, a strange blend of the mundane and the medically macabre. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit. A barber surgeon, in the course of examining a client's scalp for a haircut or a minor ailment, might stumble upon an unexplained patch of hair loss or a strange lesion. For them, this wasn't just a physical anomaly. It was a potential diagnostic nightmare in an era that lacked modern understanding. While they might attempt basic remedies, their knowledge was limited, and the societal anxieties about sin, curses, and demonic influence would undoubtedly color their interpretations. Imagine a barber surgeon, razor in hand, suddenly pausing, his eyes widening as he spots a perfect, unsettlingly smooth bald spot on your head, prompting not a medical diagnosis but a worried glance or a hushed recommendation to see a priest. Historians still argue whether barber surgeons, given their dual role, were more likely to dismiss hair loss as a trivial matter, or if they were particularly attuned to its potential spiritual implications due to their intimate work with the human head and their exposure to popular superstitions. Did their practical skills ground them, or did their constant exposure to the body's vulnerabilities make them more superstitious? Regardless, they were on the front lines, witnessing these mysterious physical changes. You'd probably find yourself nervously anticipating their reaction, hoping they'd simply tell you it was the humors, rather than giving you a look that suggested a deeper, more terrifying problem. You're now seeing how even the most mundane interactions, like getting a haircut, could become fraught with spiritual anxiety. The barber surgeon, with his intimate knowledge of the head and scalp, inadvertently became a reluctant gatekeeper, observing symptoms that could be interpreted as horrifying signs of demonic touch or moral decay. Their inability to offer a simple, physical cure for inexplicable hair loss only pushed the afflicted and the community further towards supernatural explanations, solidifying the terrifying link between a bald patch and something far more sinister. You've just considered the peculiar role of the barber surgeon, a practical figure caught between the mundane and the deeply superstitious. Now, let's explore how the chilling beliefs about hair loss and demonic possession permeated the visual culture of the era, examining artistic depictions of possession. These images, found in paintings, engravings, and religious illustrations, powerfully shaped public perception, often portraying possessed individuals with telltale physical signs, including disheveled or sparse hair, reinforcing the terror in the popular imagination. It's a mainstream historical fact that art in the medieval and early modern periods served as a primary means of communication and instruction for a largely illiterate populace. Religious themes, including the struggle between good and evil, saints and demons, were ubiquitous. When it came to depicting demonic possession, artists weren't just illustrating biblical stories. They were often reflecting contemporary beliefs and anxieties, drawing upon popular accounts of exorcisms and witch trials. You can almost feel the visceral impact of seeing such an image in a church or a devotional book. The dramatic scene unfolding before your eyes, designed to both instruct and terrify. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit: many artistic renditions of possessed individuals, particularly those from the Baroque period onwards when the Counter-Reformation intensified focus on demonic threats, show them with wildly disarrayed, matted, or even visibly thinning hair. While some might argue this was simply artistic license to convey madness or distress, the consistency of this portrayal suggests a deeper symbolic meaning. If a demon was twisting and contorting the body, it made sense that the hair, seen as a direct extension of the vital self, would also be affected. Imagine a painting of a possessed person, their face contorted in agony, their once neat hair now a tangled, falling mess, almost as if the internal struggle was physically tearing it from their scalp. It was less about a bad hair day for the portrait and more about a horrifying visual cue for the audience. Historians still argue whether these artistic depictions directly influenced popular belief about the physical symptoms of possession, or if they merely reflected existing societal anxieties about such manifestations. Did the art create the fear, or merely mirror it? Regardless, the symbiosis was powerful. These images served as constant visual reminders that demonic presence could physically alter the human form, and hair, in its disarray or absence, was a potent signifier. You'd probably find yourself recoiling from such images, internalizing the idea that your hair was not merely an aesthetic feature, but a potential canvas for terrifying demonic signs. You're now seeing how visual propaganda, intentional or not, played a crucial role in cementing the connection between hair loss and demonic possession. The artists, drawing from popular anxieties and religious dogma, created powerful images that reinforced the idea that a disheveled or thinning head of hair wasn't just unfortunate, it was a visible sign, literally painted into the collective consciousness, of infernal torment and demonic ownership. You've just witnessed how art etched the image of demonically affected hair into the collective mind. Now, let's explore the other side of the coin, the desperate human attempts to counter these perceived demonic threats through the power of charms and amulets. In a world where hair loss could signal infernal touch, it was only natural that people would seek magical and spiritual protections, sometimes even incorporating hair itself, to ward off evil and safeguard their bodies and souls. It's a mainstream historical fact that throughout the medieval and early modern periods, alongside formal religious practices, people widely relied on various charms, talismans, and amulets for protection against misfortune, illness, and especially malevolent spirits. These could range from blessed objects and relics to more overtly magical items inscribed with symbols or protective verses. The belief was that these objects created a spiritual shield, deflecting the unseen attacks that could cause physical blight, including inexplicable hair loss. You can almost feel the worn smoothness of a small, polished stone clutched tightly in a fearful hand, imbued with hope and desperate faith. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit. Some protective charms or counterspells specifically targeted the preservation of hair or the reversal of its loss, reflecting the deep anxiety around it. For instance, certain folk remedies for unexplained hair loss might involve wearing a specific amulet, carrying a particular herb, or performing a ritual that invoked benevolent spirits to mend the perceived breach in one's spiritual defenses. Conversely, some of these charms might even incorporate a tiny piece of hair from a holy person or a revered animal, believed to transfer their protective essence to the wearer. It was less about raw gain and more about righteous relics. Imagine someone carefully stitching a small bag, placing a tiny lock of hair from a revered local saint inside, hoping it would ward off the invisible forces literally plucking at their scalp. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of charms and amulets reflected a lack of faith in official church teachings, or if it was a complementary layer of popular religiosity that addressed immediate, tangible fears that formal theology didn't always satisfy. Was it a rebellion against doctrine, or a practical extension of it? Regardless, the sheer prevalence of these protective practices highlights the profound fear of invisible forces, including those that could manifest as physical afflictions like hair loss. You'd probably find yourself instinctively reaching for a lucky charm or muttering a small prayer if you felt an unexplained chill or a strange tingle on your scalp. You're now seeing the human response to overwhelming fear, a desperate search for control in a seemingly chaotic, spiritually charged world. The belief that hair loss was a sign of demonic possession directly fueled the market, so to speak, for these protective charms and amulets. If your hair was literally being tugged by demons, then you needed every spiritual weapon at your disposal to fight back, turning these objects into potent symbols of hope against an invisible, terrifying enemy. You've just witnessed the human need for protective charms against unseen evils. Now, let's step back and consider the broader currents that made these terrifying beliefs about hair loss and demonic possession so incredibly pervasive. There were psychological factors of belief. It wasn't just about lack of scientific knowledge. Deep-seated human psychology, amplified by societal conditions, played a crucial role in making such horrifying interpretations feel not only plausible, but often undeniably true. It's a mainstream historical fact that in pre-modern societies, life was often brutal, short, and unpredictable. Faced with widespread disease, famine, war, and inexplicable natural disasters, people sought meaning and control in a chaotic world. When things went wrong, especially in profoundly personal ways like physical affliction, the human mind instinctively looked for a cause, a reason, a culprit. In an age dominated by religious doctrine, the supernatural realm provided ready-made explanations. If your crops failed, it was divine wrath. If your child fell ill, it was a demon. You can almost feel the relentless pressure of a life lived on the edge, constantly seeking patterns and explanations, even if they led to terrifying conclusions. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit: the psychological phenomenon of the confirmation bias played a huge role. Once the belief that hair loss could be a sign of demonic possession was established, people would actively look for evidence to support it and interpret ambiguous information in its favor. If someone with unexplained baldness also exhibited unusual behavior, perhaps due to stress, mental illness, or simply a quirky personality, it would be seen as confirmation of demonic influence. The more examples observed, the more solid the proof became in the collective mind, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of fear and conviction. Imagine a village elder, confidently pointing to a new bald patch on a troubled individual, saying, "See, just as I suspected." Historians still argue whether mass hysteria and the social reinforcement of these beliefs were the primary drivers of witchcraft accusations and fear of possession, or if genuine, if misguided, theological conviction was the leading force. Was it a collective psychological feedback loop, or a sincere, albeit flawed, religious interpretation? Regardless, the psychological impact was profound. You'd probably find yourself not only susceptible to these beliefs, but actively participating in their perpetuation, scrutinizing your neighbors and yourself for any telltale signs, forever seeking to validate the terrifying narrative. You're now grasping the powerful, often insidious, role of human psychology in shaping belief. The fear of the unknown, the need for explanation, the power of suggestion, and the terrifying weight of communal consensus all combine to transform something as physically unsettling as hair loss into an undeniable sign of demonic activity. This deep psychological embedding ensured that the belief lingered, even as the world slowly began its hesitant march towards scientific understanding. You've just pondered the psychological bedrock that made beliefs in demonic hair loss so potent. Now, let's begin to trace the very slow, often halting, shift away from purely supernatural explanations as the One Enlightenment's skepticism dawns. This period marked the hesitant beginnings of scientific inquiry, a new way of thinking that, while not immediately eradicating old fears, certainly started to chip away at the monolithic hold of demonic explanations for physical phenomena. It's a mainstream historical fact that the 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of rationalism, empiricism, and a new emphasis on observable phenomena and logical deduction. Think of figures like Isaac Newton or John Locke, whose work laid the groundwork for modern science and philosophy. This intellectual shift didn't instantly dispel all superstitions. Old habits die hard, especially terrifying ones. But it began to challenge the automatic assumption that every unexplained illness or bodily change was the direct handiwork of God or the devil. You can almost feel the fresh breeze of intellectual curiosity, slowly pushing back against the stifling air of unquestioning dogma. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit: while outright belief in demonic possession as a cause for common ailments began to wane among the educated elite, many early scientists still struggled to offer truly biological explanations for complex physical phenomena like hair loss. They might attribute it to bad humors or weak constitution with less spiritual overtones, but the actual mechanisms remain mysterious. So, While they might scoff at a demon pulling out your hair, they still couldn't definitively tell you why it was falling out. This lingering mystery, of course, left small openings for older superstitions to persist, especially among the less educated populace. It was less about fully understanding and more about cautiously saying, probably not a demon, but we're still working on it. Historians still argue whether the decline in witchcraft accusations and overt fears of demonic possession was primarily due to the direct influence of Enlightenment thought, or if it was also a result of changing social structures, political stability, and the growing authority of secular law over ecclesiastical courts. Was it pure reason or a combination of factors? Regardless, the seeds of doubt were sown. You'd probably find yourself catching whispers of these new, revolutionary ideas, perhaps feeling a cautious glimmer of hope that not every inexplicable physical change was an automatic sentence of damnation or demonic servitude. You're now witnessing a slow but profound intellectual earthquake. The old edifice of supernatural explanation, while still standing firmly in many minds, was starting to show cracks. The automatic leap from unexplained hair loss to demonic possession began to feel less like an undeniable truth and more like one possibility among others, albeit a terrifyingly persistent one. This nascent skepticism marked the beginning of a long journey towards modern medical understanding, slowly liberating hair loss from its demonic chains. You've just witnessed the hesitant, intellectual dawn of the Enlightenment, slowly nudging the demonic out of every unexplained ailment. Now, let's accelerate slightly into the blossoming of the medical revolution itself and the emergence of new theories that finally started to provide tangible, biological explanations for phenomena like hair loss, gradually unlinking it from the infernal. This was a painstaking process, but it fundamentally changed how people viewed their bodies and their afflictions. It's a mainstream historical fact that the 18th and 19th centuries were periods of immense medical advancement. The development of microscopy allowed for the study of tiny organisms. The understanding of cellular structures began to emerge, and systematic anatomical and physiological studies provided unprecedented insights into the human body. Physicians, now more likely to be trained in universities rather than by apprenticeships with barber surgeons, started to look for physical causes for physical symptoms. Instead of humors or demons, they began to consider infections, inflammation, and later, nutritional deficiencies. You can almost smell the formaldehyde in anatomy labs, replacing the incense of exorcisms as the primary scent of understanding the human condition. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit. One of the early yet significant steps towards understanding hair loss was the identification of some fungal infections. As a cause, conditions like tinea capitis, ringworm of the scalp, which causes patchy hair loss and scalp scaling, were finally attributed to a microscopic organism rather than a devil's scratch. Imagine the relief, and perhaps a touch of disappointment for the more dramatically inclined, when a bald spot was explained not by an unseen demon, but by a tiny, visible fungus. It was a revolutionary concept. Your hair wasn't falling out because you were sinful. It was falling out because you had encountered a microscopic villain that could be identified and, eventually, treated. Historians still argue whether the pace of this medical enlightenment was primarily driven by groundbreaking discoveries, or if societal shifts towards industrialization and urbanization, which created new public health challenges, provided the impetus for more practical and scientific medical solutions. Did the science push society, or did society pull the science regardless? The cumulative effect was profound. You'd probably find yourself embracing these new ideas, cautiously at first, then with increasing relief as the terrifying specter of demonic causation began to recede, replaced by the more manageable, if still challenging, problems of biology. You're now firmly in an era where the human body is slowly but surely becoming a subject of scientific inquiry rather than theological speculation. Hair loss, once a terrifying harbinger of demonic possession, was gradually being reclassified. It was transitioning from a spiritual crisis to a medical problem. albeit one that would take many more decades, even centuries, to fully understand and effectively treat. The era of the demon as the primary cause of a bald spot was slowly, mercifully drawing to a close. You've just witnessed the dawn of the medical revolution, beginning to offer biological explanations for hair loss and chipping away at the demonic narrative. However, while scientific understanding gained ground, it's crucial to acknowledge that persistent pockets of superstition lingered stubbornly, especially in rural communities or among those untouched by the new scientific thought. The old fears didn't simply vanish overnight, they receded into the shadows, waiting for moments of stress or misunderstanding to resurface. It's a mainstream historical fact that scientific progress, even groundbreaking discoveries, rarely spread uniformly or instantaneously across all segments of society. Education was limited, communication was slow, and deeply ingrained cultural and religious beliefs held immense power. So, while university-trained doctors might scoff at the idea of a demon pulling out your hair, a frightened villager in a remote hamlet, facing an inexplicable physical ailment like sudden hair loss, might still instinctively turn to folk healers, local priests, or old wives' tales that whispered of curses and malevolent spirits. You can almost feel the weight of centuries of tradition, pressing down on fragile new ideas. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit even into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Documented cases of localized witch scares or demon possessions sometimes still cited physical changes, including hair abnormalities, as evidence. These were often in isolated areas where access to modern medicine was scarce and traditional beliefs remained strong. Imagine a child developing patchy alopecia, and instead of a trip to a clinic, the family performs traditional rituals, convinced that an envious neighbor's curse, perhaps orchestrated by a minor demon, is to blame. It was less about widespread belief and more about stubborn, regional holdouts of terror. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these superstitions was primarily due to a lack of education and access to scientific knowledge, or if it also reflected a human psychological need for explanations that provided a sense of agency or meaning in the face of suffering, even if terrifying. Did people cling to the old ways because they knew no better, or because those explanations felt more emotionally satisfying than a cold, biological diagnosis they couldn't grasp? Regardless, the fear of hair loss as a sign of something sinister certainly didn't disappear with the invention of the microscope. You'd probably find yourself walking a fine line, publicly acknowledging the new science while privately harboring old anxieties, especially when faced with something truly inexplicable. You're now seeing that progress isn't a straight line. The demonic explanation for hair loss may have faded from the forefront of intellectual thought, but it continued to haunt the fringes, a ghostly echo of earlier centuries. These persistent pockets of superstition serve as a powerful reminder of how deeply fear can embed itself in the human psyche, and how long it can take for rational understanding to truly dispel the shadows of the past. You've just acknowledged how stubbornly old fears lingered, even as the scientific tide began to turn. Now, let's make a definitive leap into a modern understanding of alopecia, contrasting it sharply with those chilling historical views. We'll explore how science has demystified hair loss, replacing supernatural dread with biological explanation, proving that your scalp isn't a battleground for demons, but a complex biological system. It's a mainstream historical fact that modern medicine, building on centuries of scientific inquiry, now understands hair loss, or alopecia, as a complex condition with a variety of well-defined biological causes. These include genetic predisposition, like androgenetic alopecia, or male-female pattern baldness. Autoimmune conditions like alopecia areata, where the immune system mistakenly attacks hair follicles, hormonal imbalances, thyroid issues, postpartum changes, nutritional deficiencies, iron, zinc, stress, telogen effluvium, certain medications, and fungal infections. The fear of the unknown has been replaced by diagnostic categories and, often, treatment protocols. You can almost feel the calm assurance of a doctor explaining a diagnosis based on observable science. rather than invoking unseen entities. This leads to a particularly quirky tidbit, one of the most common forms of sudden, patchy hair loss. Alopecia areata is an autoimmune condition where the body's own immune system attacks its hair follicles, leading to distinct, smooth, bald spots. For centuries, such a sudden, inexplicable loss of hair would have been prime territory for demonic interpretation, perhaps a devil's mark, or the result of a malevolent spirit's touch. Today, while it remains a challenging condition, it is understood as a physiological malfunction, not a spiritual curse. Imagine the sheer relief of someone from the medieval period if they could be told, it's just your own immune system being a bit overzealous, not Satan. Historians still argue whether the demystification of conditions like alopecia and the broader shift from supernatural to biological explanations has truly alleviated all human anxieties about health in the body, or if new forms of anxiety have simply replaced the old ones, genetic predispositions instead of divine curses. Has the external demon been replaced by an internal biological one? Regardless, the core fear of demonic hair loss is now largely confined to the historical record, a relic of a less informed age. You'd probably find yourself marveling at the sheer volume of knowledge gained, grateful for a world where a bald patch usually means a dermatologist visit, not an exorcism. You're now standing firmly in the present, looking back at the long, winding road of human understanding. The journey from attributing hair loss to demonic possession to understanding its complex biological mechanisms is a testament to the power of scientific inquiry. It highlights how far humanity has come in deciphering the mysteries of the body, liberating us from the terrifying grip of supernatural explanations for common afflictions. You've just arrived in the present, having journeyed through millennia of fear and scientific awakening regarding hair loss. Now, let's consider the echoes of ancient fears today. While we understand the biological basis of alopecia, remnants of those deep-seated superstitious anxieties about physical imperfections and the unconscious desire for supernatural explanations still subtly influence our modern perceptions, proving just how deeply ingrained these historical beliefs once were. It's a mainstream historical fact that cultural narratives, once deeply embedded, have a remarkable persistence, even long after their original literal interpretations have faded. While no one seriously believes a bald spot is a literal devil's mark anymore, there's often an underlying, almost unconscious, discomfort or even a moral judgment subtly attached to visible physical differences, hearkening back to a time when such things signified impurity or ill omen. Think about the enduring power of superstitions, even in highly rationalized societies crossing fingers, knocking on wood, or avoiding black cats. We know they aren't rational, but we do them anyway. A quirky tidbit of human psychology. You can almost feel the faint tremor of ancient dread, even when you know it's illogical, lingering just beneath the surface of modern consciousness. Historians still argue whether the lingering societal stigma associated with certain physical conditions, including hair loss, is a direct, albeit unconscious, inheritance from past supernatural interpretations, or if it simply stems from universal human aesthetic preferences and biases. Is it a historical hangover, or just human nature? Regardless, the historical weight of perceiving hair loss as a sign of something wrong, whether physically, morally, or spiritually, contributes to the very real psychological distress many people experience with alopecia today. The pressure to conform, to look perfect, often feels like a secularized version of ancient anxieties about being marked or blemished. You'd probably find yourself subtly noticing hair loss in others, perhaps feeling a pang of empathy, but also acknowledging the subconscious societal messages that still associate it, however faintly, with a perceived lack or imperfection. Even in our scientifically advanced age, when faced with truly inexplicable medical conditions or moments of extreme personal crisis, the human mind can sometimes still grasp at non-rational explanations. When every scientific explanation falls short, a tiny, ancient corner of the brain might still whisper about curses, divine displeasure, or unseen forces. These aren't full-blown fears of demonic possession, but rather faint, almost imperceptible echoes, a testament to the powerful historical narratives we've explored. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll look at your own hair, or lack thereof, with a new understanding. No longer a canvas for demonic torment or divine wrath, but a testament to the incredible journey of human understanding. The fear of hair loss as a sign of demonic possession is a whisper from a long-lost past, a fascinating, terrifying chapter in the enduring story of how humanity grapples with the mysteries of the body and the vast, often unsettling, unknown. Sweet dreams.